could believe, looking at life in France in 1914, that the country, along with the whole of Europe, was about to be struck by one of the most terrible tragedies in history. It is true that Alsace-Lorraine was still an unhealed wound, and that there was bitter hatred of the Germans, still known by the insulting name of Les Boches. But nobody really thought that war was possible. There had been peace for nearly 45 years. It was the time of the Franco-Russian alliance, and the Entente Cordiale had replaced the old rivalry with Britain. But the danger was there. Europe's peace was an armed one. The Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted a place in the sun. The Parisian crowd filled the Avenue du Bois. Paris danced in the beautiful summer of 1914. And then a spark set everything aflame.
In 1914, Europe embarked on a catastrophic war that would eventually engulf combatants from all 5 continents. It was a global war, fought on land, sea and air, claiming 4 empires and over 10 million lives. Many more lives were blighted by the effects of war. It left Europe, once the cultural center of the world, so deeply divided by political rancor and racial hatred that a Second World War was inevitable. The tragedy is that the First World War need not have happened at all, but for a little more prudence and common goodwill. There were many things that united Europe in the hot summer of 1914. Much of the continent's culture and society were shared institutions. Her royal houses were linked by blood or marriage. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II was the nephew of Britain's Edward VII and a cousin of Tsar Nicholas of Russia. At Edward VII's funeral, no less than 7 crowned heads of state followed his coffin. The royal heads also held honorary positions in each other's armed forces. For example, here is the newly crowned George V and Tsar Nicholas dressed in German uniforms. But there are also many simmering tensions. The rapid rise of a united Germany in the world order of the industrial nations was a particular source of tension. France was particularly implacable. She still harbored a deep resentment following her humiliating defeat by Prussia in 1871 and the loss of territories in Alsace and Lorraine. France's great ally, Russia, was also increasingly alarmed by Germany's rise, as it threatened her dominance in Central and Eastern Europe. Britain, on the other hand, remained rather aloof from the problems of her European neighbours, basking in the security and prestige that came with her empire and Commonwealth. But Britain was alarmed by growing German militarism. Germany wanted a place on the top table of nations and was prepared to use force of arms to establish its credentials. Although most of Germany is landlocked, the Kaiser was deeply envious of Britain's Royal Navy. He was determined to have a fleet to rival the Royal Navies. In Admiral von Tirpitz, he had an enthusiastic supporter who set about turning the Kaiser's dream into a reality, much to Britain's consternation. In 1905, HMS Dreadnought had been built and launched in 4 months. This new class of battleship represented an enormous step forward, giving the Royal Navy a significant advantage, even though she cost over £3 million to build. Her launch led to an arms race as the world's navies realized the Dreadnought represented the future of sea power. Britain was as determined to maintain her naval superiority as the Germans were to try to match it. A new class of super dreadnoughts appeared in 1913. The Queen Elizabeth had 15-inch guns, the biggest in the world, which could deliver a single 15,000-pound broadside. She was also relatively fast, as she was the first battleship to use oil-fired boilers. Her presence also increased the tempo of the arms race, as now every other navy wanted one of these super dreadnoughts, but time was running out. The tensions in Europe were also sharpened by the knowledge that potential or imagined enemies had prepared detailed war plans. These intricate plans left little to chance and included rigid timetables of troop movements and carefully prepared lists of objectives. Central to planning the troop movements were Europe's roads and rail networks. In the Franco-Prussian War, the Prussians had mobilized quickly and effectively, using the rail networks to swiftly transport forces to where they were needed, while French trains remained idle, trapped in a gridlock in their own terminals. Arguably, the most controversial plan was Germany's Schlieffen Plan. The plan was prepared by Alfred von Schlieffen, who was chief of the German Great General Staff from 1891. The plan, published in 1905, was conceived against a background notion of encirclement, with France to the west and Russia in the east. The plan timetabled in minute detail the mobilization of 1 million men who would defeat France in 42 days before heading east to defeat the Russians. It was assumed that Russia would take this long to mobilize due to the sheer vastness of the country. Central to the plan's successful outcome was a swinging attack to come in from the west of Paris, while the main forces flooded across the Belgian and Luxembourg borders to the northeast of the French capital. But the plan, for all its detail, was flawed on 2 counts. First, the quickest and easiest route to Paris was from the north, which meant passing through neutral Belgium, where fortifications were relatively light. Secondly, Schlieffen assumed that British involvement would be minimal, restricted to protecting the Channel ports at best. Belgian neutrality was supposed to be guaranteed by the international treaty signed in 1839 by Britain and Germany, among others. In the years leading up to the war, Schlieffen's successors tinkered with the program. But when it came to war in August 1914, the Germans failed to stick to their master plan. Fatally, they failed to heed Schlieffen's dying words, "Keep the right wing strong." The result was that despite initial success, they could not capitalize on their gains, and thus the Germans were obliged to adopt a defensive posture until the spring of 1918. Knowledge of the Schlieffen plan's existence and some of its contents was alarming for the French and only fueled their paranoia. A series of war plans were devised, culminating in the Plan 17, finalized in the summer of 1914. France's principal objective was the recapture of Alsace and Lorraine. French planners believed that the offensive spirit alone could win the day. Thus, by mounting an unyielding attack in the Alsace, they hoped to overwhelm the Germans, forcing them to pull in reserves from their other fronts. What Plan 17 failed to recognize was that French forces were to be massed away from the brunt of where the German attack was to come. It could not have been worse for the French, or better for the Germans. France and Germany, like all the major belligerents, had large standing armies as a result of conscription. The presence of so many armies, coupled with the self-propelling war plans, only added to the atmosphere of instability. Once the order for mobilization was given, over 3 million men would be on the move in these two countries alone. It was a common belief among military and political leaders, and even the general public, that the timetables that moved the trains, that moved the armies, represented a machine that once set in motion could not be stopped. Thus the order to mobilize became synonymous with a declaration of war, not a precursor to it. Britain, on the other hand, did not have conscription and so relied on a regular army of 150,000 men. On the outbreak of war, this expeditionary force was to be transported to the French border with Belgium, a process that would take some 21 days after mobilization. With so much instability in the region, it was only a matter of time before something sparked a Europe-wide war. At the time, it was generally assumed that a war would only last a few weeks or possibly months. Nobody envisaged the 4 years of slaughter that lay ahead. The spark that ignited the First World War was fired on Sunday, June 28, 1914. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie were on a visit to Sarajevo, the Serbian capital. Gavril Princip, a member of a Serbian nationalist group, was presented with an unexpected opportunity to draw attention to their cause. As the driver turned the imperial couple's car around after taking a wrong turn, Princip drew his pistol and fired twice, killing Franz Ferdinand and his wife. Had Austria taken immediate action, the rest of Europe would probably have sympathized. Instead, there was prevarication in Vienna until 4 weeks later an impossible ultimatum was issued that even the German Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, thought was too harsh. In response, Russia began to mobilize her forces in support of her Serbian ally. Germany, who had reassured her Austrian ally that their support was unwavering, also began to mobilize. For good measure, she demanded that France stay neutral and, as an act of good faith, hand over forts on their mutual frontier. France, of course, could not accept. and also declared full mobilization late in the afternoon of July the 31st. On Monday, August the 3rd, Germany declared war on France. At the same time, the Belgians refused a German demand for passage through their country. In Britain, it was the August bank holiday, and many people had set off on their holidays, unaware of the disaster that was beginning to unfold. On Tuesday the 4th, the German army crossed into Belgium as the Schlieffen Plan was put into motion. Britain demanded an immediate withdrawal, but was ignored. In fact, Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg dismissed Britain's treaty with Belgium as just a scrap of paper. At midnight, Britain declared war on Germany. France had mobilized over 1.7 million men, organized in 5 armies, and transported them to its northeast frontier. Germany had transported 1.5 million men, organized into 7 armies, to the French and Belgian borders. A further 200,000 were sent to East Prussia to defend against a Russian attack. The Russians, unwilling to wait for their vast armies to mobilize, began to advance into East Prussia with 2 armies, each with 300,000 men. The British were behind schedule, but because our army was much smaller, it did not take as long. The British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, that sailed to France consisted of 2 army corps and a cavalry division, in total 150,000 men. The BEF was to take out positions along the Mons-Condé Canal, just inside Belgium. There followed a brief interlude of 5 to 10 days while supplies were brought up and troops detrained and marched on foot to their start positions. The Germans' advance was already behind schedule due to the spirited defense put up by a tiny Belgian army, 200,000 men. The Germans had had to bring up enormous howitzers to pound the Belgian forts at some considerable cost in lives. The consequences of having to alter the timetable, especially on the all-important right wing, would have serious ramifications in the weeks that followed. The major campaign of the war began with the Battle of the Frontiers. Five offensives were launched by the French under the command of Joseph Joffre. The 10 days during which the battles were fought were to prove costly. Over 300,000 French soldiers were killed. The battles at Mulhouse, Lorraine, the Ardennes, Charleroi and Mons were launched more or less simultaneously and marked the collision of both French Plan 17 and the German Schlieffen Plan. With colours unfurled and bands playing, the French launched their initial attacks, their infantry advancing with bayonets fixed. The opening attack at Mulhouse was successful, as were the opening attacks in Lorraine. But the Germans were simply withdrawing in order to lure the French infantry into traps. They could be blasted by machine guns and heavy artillery. In mounting their counterattack, the Germans succeeded in driving the French back to their start positions. But French reconnaissance aircraft spotted the German build-up and so prepared an adequate defense. When the Germans attacked on August the 24th, they were unable to make significant gains. Despite repeated attempts, the French line held, leading to stalemate and trench warfare. At the same time as the Germans mounted their counter-offensive in Lorraine, they also mounted a major attack in the Ardennes, the densely wooded terrain that straddles the Franco-Belgian border. The French had anticipated meeting such a large German force when it began its attack on August the 21st. But French offensive spirit was no match against well-placed machine guns and artillery. And within 2 days, the French armies were in full flight, only halting the Germans at Sedan and Verdun. Meanwhile, at Charleroi, the Germans inflicted their first outright defeat on the French Fifth Army, commanded by General Lamrezac. Lamrezac had foreseen the German build-up in Belgium, but he was prevented from extending his army north by Joffre, his commander-in-chief. By the time Joffre relented on August the 20th, the German Second Army was nearing Namur. Although Lamrezac wanted to hold off attacking until the British Expeditionary Force was in position, the Germans had already secured 2 bridgeheads across the River Somme. 2 days of heavy fighting followed, with the French taking heavy casualties. But to the west, the line collapsed, exposing the right wing of the British Expeditionary Force at Mons. With news of the French retreat from the Ardennes, Lamrezac was forced to order a general withdrawal of his forces. In so doing, he probably saved the French army from complete destruction. But Joffre chose to make him a scapegoat for French failures and for the failure of Plan 17. At Mons, the British and German forces fought their first battle beginning on August the 23rd. The Germans had not expected to come across the BEF under the command of Sir John French as it sought to link up with General Lamrezac's Fifth Army in Charleroi. Sir John French had 2 infantry corps deployed across a 40-kilometre front east and west of Mons, with the canal in front of them. Their eastern flank almost reached the retreating French Fifth Army. But Sir John French had not anticipated meeting the German First Army as it pursued the retreating French, and certainly not in strength. The Germans outnumbered the British 2-to-1 in infantry and guns, but their opening attacks proved disastrous. The British infantryman was equipped with a magazine-loaded Lee Enfield rifle, and he was trained to fire 15 rounds per minute, accurately. As a result, the Germans were cut down in droves. Indeed, many reported the British seemed to have a great many machine guns. Such was the rapidity and accuracy of their fire. But British losses were also high, some 1,600. Realizing that the BEF was not going to be relieved by Lamrezac, French ordered a retreat. The Germans chose not to give chase, as they had taken many casualties. But the Great Retreat had begun. It would take the British and French armies to the very outskirts of Paris. On August the 26th, 2 corps under General Smith-Dorrien were forced to turn and engage the enemy at Le Cateau. Exhausted by their days of constant marching and fighting, and likely to come under heavy attack anyway, Smith-Dorrien decided they would have a better chance of making a fighting stand. Again, the quaintly named musketry skills of the British infantrymen came to the fore. The German advance was slowed sufficiently to enable the British to organize another retreat. But the cost had been high. Nearly 8,000 British soldiers had become casualties. Their sacrifice, however, was not in vain, for the Germans' advance on Paris had been delayed. East of the city, on the Marne, that the exhausted Allied armies were able to mount a fresh offensive. Beginning on September the 6th, the French Sixth Army attacked on the Germans' right flank. In turning to meet the attack, a 30-mile wide gap opened up, which the Allies were quick to exploit. In desperate fighting, 6,000 French reserve troops were ferried from Paris in a stream of taxis. It was enough to save the day, and the gap was further widened by a surprise attack launched by the French Fifth Army on September the 8th. Fearing an Allied breakthrough, the German Chief of Staff, Helmut von Moltke, ordered a retreat. They retreated for 40 miles to well-prepared defences on the River Aisne. There they would remain for the next 4 years. The Battle of the Marne was a strategic success for the French and the British, as they had succeeded in throwing back the German offensive and reclaiming some of the territory lost in the weeks before. It effectively ended any hopes the Germans may have had of bringing the war on the Western Front to an early close. It was also the end of the war of movement that had characterized the conflict thus far. From now on, the two sides settled into an increasingly familiar pattern of trench warfare. The Germans, dug into well-prepared defences, would have to be moved by Allied attacks. The cost had been high. The French suffered some 250,000 losses, the Germans a similar amount. The BEF had suffered a further 12,733 casualties. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the war was going well for the Germans. At the beginning of August, two Russian armies had invaded eastern Prussia. General Samenov's Second Army had advanced from the southeast, and General Rennenkampf's First Army had advanced from the northeast. The plan was for the First Army to engage the Germans' Eighth Army under General Prittwitz in a frontal attack, while Samsonov's army engulfed the Germans from the rear. Initially the campaign went well, but Rennenkampf loathed Samsonov, and his personal vendetta was to result in a catastrophic defeat for the Russians at Tannenberg. The Germans, aware of the friction between the two commanders, intercepted uncoded messages between the two armies and were thus able to set a trap for the unwitting Samsonov. In the ensuing action, some 95,000 Russians were captured and 30,000 killed. Only 10,000 Russians managed to escape. Samsonov shot himself rather than face the disgrace of reporting the disaster. Tannenberg made the reputations of two German generals who would play a central role in the future conduct of the war: Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. The battles of the first month of the war had taken its toll on the tiny British expeditionary force. To Lord Kitchener, it was certain to last at least 3 years and not be over by Christmas, as popular opinion had it. The government refused to countenance conscription, and so Kitchener decided to capitalize on the mass patriotic fervor that had swept the country at the outbreak of the war. He initially called for 100,000 volunteers using one of the most famous advertising posters of all time. Men flooded into recruiting offices, and Kitchener dropped the 100,000 limit. By the end of 1914, over 1 million men had responded to his call. Rather than create new regiments, the new recruits were simply absorbed into new battalions. By the war's end, some regiments had over 40 battalions. Many of these new battalions were raised from men with a common interest or profession, or who came from the same town or city. They became universally known as Pals Battalions, and although the policy of keeping groups of men together may have played its part in maintaining morale, the high levels of casualties meant that whole communities were denuded of their menfolk after the war. The main problem with Kitchener's new armies was equipping, clothing and training them. Most of the regular officers had been sent to France, and so offers of help from former soldiers were gratefully accepted, even though some of their knowledge was hopelessly out of date. Other officers were found from public schools' officer training corps. They were given temporary commissions and were known by regulars rather disparagingly as temporary gentlemen. Rifles were also in short supply, and so early drill had to be performed using broomsticks. In France, the BEF was grappling with the new style of warfare. Trenches began scouring the French countryside from the Swiss border all the way up to the North Sea in Belgium. The BEF had learnt, for example, that digging trenches on the forward slopes of hills made them easier to target by the enemy's artillery observers. Thus, they now began digging in on the reverse side of the slope. It was during the autumn that the war on the Western Front became mobile again. Each side began a series of maneuvers, heading northwards in an attempt to outflank the other. It became known as the race for the sea, but the result was further stalemate. The BEF found itself centered on the ancient Belgian cloth town of Ypres. Unpronounceable to most of the British Tommies, it became universally known as Wipers. It became a name synonymous with death and destruction, and the scene of some of the worst fighting on the Western Front. The surrounding countryside was low-lying and boggy, and the climate wet. As a result, water could not drain away, and trenches could not be dug deep enough without encountering more water. What high ground there was had been occupied by the Germans, leaving the British positions so exposed that canvas screens had to be erected in an attempt to obscure troop movements. Unable to make any progress in France, the Germans decided to try and punch through the BEF at Ypres. The British knew that there were no reserves behind them, and that if the Germans succeeded in breaking through, they would probably be able to take the Channel ports and so cut the BEF's communication with Britain. Both sides threw everyone who could be spared into the fray. As in Britain, there had been a rush of patriotic fervour throughout Germany at the outbreak of war. The universities were emptied as thousands of young idealistic men rushed to volunteer. At Ypres, they died in their thousands, cut down by deadly British rifle fire as they advanced in mass ranks as if on the parade ground. It became known in Germany as the Kindermord bei Ypres, or the Massacre of the Children of Ypres. The First Battle of Ypres lasted from mid-October until mid-November. The old British Army died in the Flanders mud, men whose experience would be sorely missed in the battles to come. Some 25,000 British soldiers died, and 50,000 Germans also perished. The Kaiser had ordered his army to walk over General French's contemptible little army. It was a name that stuck. In future, to be an old contemptible was to command respect. Both sides, exhausted and frustrated by their inability to make any kind of breakthrough, stopped to lick their wounds. Some were granted a few days' leave, but it was now clear that the war would not be over by Christmas. At sea, the war was also making little progress. The First World War had begun because, in part, of the naval arms race between Britain and Germany. But by the end of 1914, neither fleets had delivered a decisive result. At Coronel, off the coast of South America, a small German raiding force had delivered the Royal Navy's first defeat in centuries. Revenge had been swift, and the raiders had been caught and sunk off the Falkland Islands. But the event that shook the British deepest was the German attack on Scarborough, Hartlepool and Whitby on December the 16th, 1914. Even though the Royal Navy knew of the impending raid, Admiral Franz von Hipper was able to lead his force through to mount their attack. At approximately 8:10 on the morning of December the 16th, the guns unleashed their bombardment. By the time it had finished, the attack left 137 civilians dead and a further 592 wounded. To make matters worse, Hipper was able to slip away, although his ships had been damaged by artillery fire from two shore batteries. An outraged British public now demanded decisive action. Meanwhile in France, the Allies mounted their first offensive since the onset of trench warfare in the autumn. The trench lines had more or less stabilized, but Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, was determined to win the war quickly. The offensive was to be launched against the entire line from Nieuport in Belgium to Verdun, throughout the Artois and Champagne regions. In the event, the winter offensive was primarily directed against the German salient at Saint-Ouen, which bulged into central France, and a smaller salient that existed further south at Saint-Mihiel. Joffre's plan was to attack the Germans' Third Army with a numerically superior force on the Saint-Ouen salient and its northern and southern edges. A further attack in the Ardennes was to be launched with the objective of cutting off the Germans' line of retreat. A series of smaller attacks began on December the 10th, followed by heavier fighting on the 20th. But despite being outnumbered, the German lines were effectively entrenched. Once again, they demonstrated the superiority of defensive warfare over the then current state of offensive warfare. Infantry attacks across open ground failed repeatedly in the face of fortified machine gun positions. But the Allied commanders were convinced that infantry could prevail, especially as they believed that the eastern offensive against the Russians was beginning to draw battalions away from France. For the soldiers sheltering in their trenches, such grand strategies meant little. As Christmas drew near, their thoughts turned to home. The heady optimism of August, when everyone believed that it would be all over by Christmas, had been replaced by a grim realization that the war was likely to last a good deal longer. On Christmas Day, soldiers on both sides left their trenches and met in no man's land to exchange cigarettes and goodwill. It was something that soldiers down through the centuries had done before, but this time it had added poignancy, given the unprecedented carnage experienced by both sides. Although senior officers tried to put a stop to such fraternizing, the Christmas truce, as it became known, lasted all day in some sectors, even longer in others. But with celebrations over, the troops returned to their trenches to resume the war. Many must have hoped that perhaps they would be home by next Christmas.